years of paying for housing, bills, and rules that seem to multiply faster than your savings, it's normal to question whether the standard way of living is really freedom or just an expensive routine. If the idea of owning land, cutting the red tape, and living on your own terms sounds appealing, here's the good news. Some Canadian provinces actually make off-grid living affordable, legal, and far simpler than you'd expect. Yes, in Canada. Before we explore which provinces let you actually live free instead of just paying for the illusion of freedom, smash that like button like you're disconnecting from the grid, and hit subscribe so you don't miss more information about living more comfortably in Canada. Let's start. 1. Saskatchewan, the prairie province that forgot to regulate everything. Saskatchewan sits in the middle of Canada with vast agricultural land, small population density outside Regina and Saskatoon, and a regulatory approach to rural living that can best be described as, we have bigger concerns than what you're doing on your own land if you're not bothering anyone. This is the province where rugged individualism isn't a political slogan, but actual lived reality for farmers and rural residents who've been doing things their own way for generations. You can buy raw land in rural Saskatchewan for $5,000 to $15,000 per acre, sometimes less if you're buying larger parcels or land that's not prime agricultural territory. We're talking actual titled land with road access, not crown land leases or remote wilderness accessible only by helicopter. Sites like Saskatchewan Farm and Ranch Kijiji and local rural realtors list properties constantly, with 10 to 40 acre parcels selling for $20,000 to $50,000 total, which is what urban Canadians pay for parking spots or down payments on condos they'll never own. Saskatchewan's building codes are administered municipally, and here's where it gets interesting. Many rural municipalities have minimal to no building code enforcement for properties outside organized hamlets. The province uses something called the Uniform Building and Accessibility Standards Act, but enforcement is left to municipalities, and rural municipalities with tiny populations and massive geographic areas simply don't have the staff, resources, or political will to enforce codes on every quarter section where someone wants to build. According to the Government of Saskatchewan's own documentation, buildings under 10 square meters, about 108 square feet, generally don't require permits in most jurisdictions. That's large enough for a small cabin or starter structure. For larger buildings, requirements vary wildly by rural municipality, with some requiring only basic safety compliance and others having virtually no requirements beyond septic systems for permanent dwellings, which we'll address shortly. The septic situation in Saskatchewan is surprisingly flexible. The province requires approved wastewater systems for permanent dwellings, but composting toilets are explicitly allowed under Saskatchewan's on-site wastewater disposal regulations as alternative treatment systems. Greywater systems can be permitted through basic holding tanks or constructed wetlands if designed properly. Many rural properties use basic septic fields that cost $5,000 to $8,000 to install, manageable compared to Ontario's $30,000 engineered systems. Crucially, Saskatchewan doesn't mandate grid connection. You can live entirely off-grid using solar, wind, or generators without anyone forcing you to connect to power lines that don't exist in rural areas anyway. Water can come from wells, which require permits but are straightforward to drill for $1,000 to $3,000 in most areas, dugouts, or rainwater collection systems that are common on farms. Property taxes in rural Saskatchewan are absurdly low. We're talking $300 to $800 annually for 40 acres with a small dwelling, which is less than urban Canadians pay monthly in condo fees. The province needs rural population and tax revenue from any source, so they're not incentivized to regulate people away from rural areas through impossible requirements. The reality check: Saskatchewan winters are brutal with temperatures hitting -35 regularly and wind that makes you question whether humans should inhabit this latitude. Your off-grid heating system needs to actually work when failure means death, not just mild discomfort. Summer brings mosquitoes, black flies, and weather that swings from beautiful to tornado warnings with minimal transition time. Employment opportunities in rural Saskatchewan are limited to agriculture, remote work, or driving to towns for service jobs. This works for people with remote income, retirees with pensions, or those willing to live extremely minimally on very little income. But if you can handle prairie isolation in winter, Saskatchewan offers legitimate off-grid freedom. 2. Manitoba, the province that's too busy with other problems. Manitoba sits east of Saskatchewan with similar geography, smaller population, and a government that's historically been too occupied with Winnipeg's issues to heavily regulate what happens in rural areas where barely anyone lives anyway. The province has some of Canada's cheapest rural land and surprisingly permissive attitudes toward alternative living, partly through design but mostly through benign neglect. Rural Manitoba land sells for $3,000 to $12,000 per acre depending on location and quality. Properties of 20 to 80 acres list regularly for $15,000 to $60,000 total on sites like Realtor.ca, Kijiji, and Rural Manitoba Realty offices. You can find titled land with road access within 2 hours of Winnipeg or Brandon for prices that make urban housing costs look like elaborate scams designed to transfer wealth from workers to property owners and banks. Manitoba's building code is based on the National Building Code but administered municipally, and here's the crucial part. Enforcement in rural municipalities is inconsistent to non-existent depending on location. Many rural municipalities don't have building inspectors or rely on part-time inspectors who cover massive geographic areas and respond mainly to complaints rather than proactively enforcing codes. The Manitoba Building Code exempts certain buildings from permits, including structures under 10 square meters. For larger buildings, requirements vary by municipality, with some requiring only basic permits for permanent dwellings and others having virtually no enforcement mechanisms for rural properties. According to Manitoba's Department of Families documentation, composting toilets and alternative wastewater systems can be approved under the On-Site Wastewater Management Systems Regulation if they meet basic treatment standards. Manitoba doesn't require grid connection for rural properties. Solar, wind, and generator power are common and accepted. Water can come from wells, permits required but straightforward, surface water sources with proper filtration, or rainwater collection. The province's Water Rights Act requires licenses for significant water use, but domestic use from wells falls under exemptions that allow reasonable household consumption without bureaucratic nightmares. Property taxes in rural Manitoba are among Canada's lowest. Expect $400 to $900 annually for 40 acres with a dwelling, less than monthly condo fees in Toronto or Vancouver. The province desperately needs rural population and isn't in a position to regulate away people willing to live in areas that are losing residents to cities. One significant advantage, Manitoba Hydro offers programs for off-grid living, including grants for renewable energy systems in remote areas. The province acknowledges that grid extension costs more than supporting off-grid systems, so they occasionally provide financial assistance rather than forcing expensive grid connections that don't make economic sense. The reality check: Manitoba has Saskatchewan's winter brutality plus more humidity and precipitation, which means dealing with snow removal and moisture management. Mosquitoes in summer are legendary, not "oh, there are some bugs," but clouds of insects that make outdoor activities genuinely difficult without netting and chemical warfare. Employment is limited to agriculture, remote work, or commuting to towns. Social isolation is real with nearest neighbors potentially kilometers away. Healthcare access requires driving to towns with clinics or hospitals, which matters as you age or if emergencies arise. 3. New Brunswick, Atlantic Canada's forgotten freedom. New Brunswick sits in Atlantic Canada with small population, struggling rural economy, and surprisingly permissive attitudes toward alternative living because frankly they need people and aren't in position to be picky about how those people choose to live. The province has some of Atlantic Canada's cheapest land and building requirements that are reasonable compared to Ontario, or BC's regulatory nightmares. Rural New Brunswick land sells for $1,000 to $8,000 per acre, with forested properties of 20 to 50 acres listing for $15,000 to $40,000 total. You can find titled land with road access, timber value, and water sources for prices that urban Canadians assume are missing zeros or somehow fraudulent. Sites like LandQuest, Purple Bricks, and local rural realtors list properties constantly with minimal buyer competition, because most Canadians don't think about New Brunswick as destination for anything except maybe vacation drives through fall colors. Before we continue with more provinces where you can actually live free instead of paying for a heavily regulated existence that enriches everyone except you, hit that subscribe button like you're claiming your independence, and drop a comment with what's stopping you from going off-grid. I will read it. New Brunswick's building code is based on National Building Code but administered provincially with municipal involvement. Here's what matters. For rural properties outside municipal boundaries or in local service districts, LSDs, building code enforcement is minimal. According to the Department of Environment and Local Government, Buildings under 10 square meters don't require permits, and larger structures require permits, but enforcement focuses mainly on safety rather than aesthetic compliance or arbitrary minimum sizes designed to maximize property taxes. The province allows composting toilets and alternative wastewater systems under the on-site sewage disposal systems regulation. You need approval for systems, but composting toilets combined with basic greywater management are explicitly permitted. Costs for approved systems run $5,000 to $10,000, manageable compared to engineered systems in other provinces. New Brunswick doesn't mandate grid connection. Solar, wind, and generators are common and accepted for rural properties. NB Power acknowledges that grid extension to remote properties costs more than it generates in revenue, so they are not forcing connections that don't make economic sense. Water can come from wells, straightforward permitting, springs, or surface sources with proper treatment. Property taxes in rural New Brunswick are reasonable at $400 to $1,000 annually for 40 acres with dwelling, depending on assessed value and local rates. The province needs population desperately and isn't interested in regulating away people willing to live in rural areas that are hemorrhaging residents to cities or other provinces. One advantage: New Brunswick has the renovation program for rural and remote areas, providing some assistance for sustainable housing in areas lacking services. The province acknowledges that alternative living supports rural population retention better than forcing expensive conventional housing requirements that drive people away. The reality check: New Brunswick's economy is weak with limited employment outside cities. Rural areas are losing population, which creates cheap land but also isolation and reduced services. Healthcare access is challenging with doctor shortages and hospital closures affecting rural regions. Winter is maritime winter, damp, gray, occasionally brutally snowy, with ice storms that can knock out power for days or weeks. Your off-grid systems need to handle extended periods without sun for solar or calm conditions for wind. Summer brings humidity, black flies, and mosquitoes that make prairie insects look amateur. 4. Newfoundland and Labrador, the rock with freedom. Newfoundland and Labrador sits as Canada's easternmost province with small population, vast geography, and regulatory approach to rural living that combines British common law traditions with pragmatic recognition that you can't heavily regulate areas where nobody lives and enforcement costs more than revenue generated. Rural Newfoundland land sells for $1,000 to $5,000 per acre, with properties of 10 to 50 acres listing for $10,000 to $30,000 total. Labrador land is even cheaper with vast acreage available for minimal cost if you're willing to embrace genuine remoteness. Sites like Newfoundland Real Estate and Kijiji show constant listings for rural properties that urban Canadians view as impossibly cheap until they realize the trade-offs in isolation and climate. Newfoundland's building code is administered provincially with municipal involvement where municipalities exist. For unincorporated areas and rural regions outside town boundaries, enforcement is minimal to non-existent. According to the Department of Municipal and Provincial Affairs, structures under 10 square meters don't require permits, and larger buildings require permits, but enforcement focuses on safety rather than micromanaging how people live on their own land. The province allows composting toilets and alternative wastewater systems under the Water Resources Act and related regulations. Approval is required, but systems that meet basic treatment standards are accepted. Many rural Newfoundland properties use basic septic systems costing $5,000 to $8,000, or composting toilet systems with greywater management that cost significantly less. Newfoundland doesn't mandate grid connection for rural properties. Newfoundland Power and Labrador Hydro acknowledge that extending grid to remote areas costs more than it generates, so off-grid solar, wind, and generators are common and accepted. Water comes from wells, which require registration but not complex permitting, surface sources, or rainwater collection common in coastal areas. Property taxes in rural Newfoundland are moderate at $500 to $1,200 annually for 40 acres with dwelling, depending on location and assessed value. The province desperately needs population retention and isn't interested in regulatory approaches that drive people away from rural areas already struggling with depopulation. One unique aspect: Newfoundland has historical traditions of outport living and self-sufficiency that create cultural acceptance of alternative lifestyles. People living remotely with minimal services isn't seen as weird or suspicious, but as continuation of how Newfoundlanders lived for generations before government decided everyone needed to move to larger towns for service efficiency. The reality check. Newfoundland weather is brutal in different ways than prairie provinces. Constant wind, fog, rain, occasional massive snowstorms, and dampness that penetrates everything. Your off-grid systems need to handle moisture and salt air that corrodes equipment faster than dry prairie conditions. Isolation is real with some rural areas, accessible mainly by boat or plane. Employment is limited to fishing, forestry, remote work, or government jobs in larger towns. Healthcare requires travel to regional hospitals, which can be challenging during winter storms that shut down roads or cancel flights. 5. Yukon Territory. Not technically a province, but who's counting? Okay, Yukon is a territory, not a province, but including it makes sense because Yukon offers some of Canada's most permissive off-grid living conditions, combined with territorial government that actually supports alternative housing through programs and policies rather than just tolerating it through neglect. Yukon land is available through various mechanisms, including purchasing private land, leasing territorial land, or participating in programs like the Agricultural Land Application Program or country residential programs that provide land for minimal cost if you meet basic development requirements. Private rural land sells for $5,000 to $20,000 per acre, with properties of 5 to 40 acres available for $30,000 to $100,000, which sounds expensive until you realize you're buying land in one of Earth's most beautiful regions, with legitimate freedom to build and live as you choose. Yukon's building code is administered territorially with enforcement focused mainly on organized communities and subdivisions. For rural properties outside municipal boundaries, building code enforcement is minimal. According to Yukon's Community Services Department, small structures under 10 square meters don't require permits, and larger buildings require permits, but the emphasis is on safety rather than micromanaging design or arbitrary minimum sizes. Yukon explicitly supports alternative housing and off-grid living through its policies. The territory allows composting toilets, greywater systems, and alternative wastewater treatment under its Civil Emergency Measures Act and health regulations. Many rural Yukoners live completely off-grid with territorial government blessing because extending services to remote areas costs more than supporting independent systems. The territory doesn't mandate grid connection. Yukon Energy acknowledges that much of the territory isn't served by grid, so solar, wind, and generators are standard. The territorial government actually provides grants through programs like the Good Energy Program, offering rebates for renewable energy systems, energy efficiency improvements, and alternative heating systems. They're paying you to go off-grid rather than forcing expensive grid connections. Water in Yukon comes from wells, surface sources, or hauling water depending on location and geology. The territory requires water licenses for significant use, but domestic consumption falls under exemptions that allow reasonable household use without bureaucratic complexity. Property taxes in Yukon are complicated but generally reasonable for rural properties, especially considering the freedom to build and live as you choose. Expect $1,000 to $2,000 annually for 40 acres with dwelling, depending on location and improvements. Yukon offers unique advantages including the Northern Residence deductions for tax purposes, providing federal tax credits for living in Northern Canada. You get money back for living somewhere beautiful and free, which is a better deal than paying premium prices for regulated suburban existence in Southern Canada. The reality check: Yukon is remote, expensive for supplies that must be trucked or flown in, and has winter darkness and cold that make prairie winters look moderate. Temperatures hit -40 regularly, and winter darkness means limited solar generation for months. Employment is limited to government, mining, tourism, or remote work. Healthcare requires travel to Whitehorse or even down south for specialists. But for people willing to handle genuine remoteness and climate challenges, Yukon offers legitimate freedom to live off-grid without government harassment, combined with territorial government that actually supports alternative living through programs and policies rather than viewing it as a problem to regulate away. The legal and practical reality of off-grid living in Canada. Here's what off-grid content often misses. Even in permissive provinces, off-grid living isn't completely regulation-free or cost-free. You still need money for land purchases, materials, tools, and systems. Wells cost $1,000 to $3,000 to drill. Solar systems cost $5,000 to $15,000 for adequate off-grid capacity. Buildings require materials costing $10,000 to $50,000 depending on size and quality. Permits, even minimal ones, cost money and require navigating bureaucracy that ranges from reasonable to deliberately obstructive, depending on which municipal employee you encounter. Property taxes continue forever regardless of services received. Vehicle registration and driver's licenses still extract money annually. You can't completely escape Canadian taxation and regulation short of illegal squatting, which creates different problems. These 5 provinces offer the most permissive conditions for off-grid living through combination of cheap land, minimal building code enforcement, acceptance of alternative systems, and governments that either support or don't care about alternative living. But permissive doesn't mean completely free or easy. Off-grid living requires skills most Canadians don't have: construction, electrical systems, plumbing, mechanical repairs, and problem-solving without calling professionals who charge $150 per hour to fix things you broke through ignorance or incompetence. It requires handling isolation, weather extremes, and lifestyle limitations that urban or suburban living smooths over through infrastructure and services. But for people with appropriate skills, realistic expectations, and genuine desire to live independently, rather than just romanticizing off-grid life through YouTube videos filmed by people who actually live in cities and visit their off-grid properties on weekends, these provinces offer legitimate opportunity to build lives with minimal regulation and maximum freedom. The choice requires honest assessment of your capabilities, finances, and tolerance for discomfort versus your hatred of monthly bills, regulations, and dependence on systems designed to extract maximum money from your existence. Off-grid living isn't for everyone, but these 5 provinces make it possible for people willing to trade convenience and services for independence and freedom. If this was helpful, just tell me by subscribing and comment below in which province you would rather go to live like this.